Group action is always necessary to do big things. Maybe it may start, something great may start with an individual, but it always ends up that there's a lot of people that need to be involved. How do we do that, and how do we keep those group actions from drowning in bureaucracy? Stay with us. Welcome to All Things Apostolic for Tuesday, December the 12th, 2023, right in the middle of the wonderful holiday season, celebrating the birth of Jesus and all that that means, and that he was not just a man, but that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. God incarnate, holy man and holy God. So this is the celebration of that season. Somebody says, well, he wasn't really born on December 25th. That's actually the celebration of a earthly pagan idol that they called God. So, yeah, that may be true. Yeah, I think you got something there. But we have taken it away. We have captured it. All things become new in Jesus. Every day of the year is holy. They all belong to us as the children of God. And we can celebrate on any day that we would like to celebrate on. And it just feels kind of good to celebrate the birth of Jesus instead of some false doctrine on December the 25th. We don't know what day he was actually born, but we celebrate his birth every day, 365 days a year. So, Merry Christmas. So I want to talk to you today about some things that are relevant to all of us, especially if you're in leadership of any kind. The attempt to promote group efforts. We all know that together we can do a lot of things that we cannot do by ourselves. And so the effort to promote group efforts, the attempt to make that work, oftentimes meets with failure or very limited success. Because when the group gets together, if there's varied opinions, there's varied ideas, there's varied ambitions, and just a lot of things enter the equation. I've given a lot of thought to this through the years because I've been involved in group efforts since I was just young. And the frustrations of working in group efforts causes many people, it causes some people to just dump the whole enterprise and go out and live in a form of isolation, which is no answer, by the way. The probably the broader effect is that people tamp down the level of their commitment to group efforts because of the frustrations, many frustrations that go along with group efforts. So one of the responses to that is that people have been in mildly successful group efforts earlier in their life, and so they just try to keep replicating that. They don't know any other model of group leadership, and so they try to replicate the old model in a new setting. And it is true that for a number of years that will work, but models change because the needs and the dynamics of the populace changes, and therefore models have to have flexibility, and some of them have to just be discarded and new models put together. The problem of trying to make our present day efforts work with old models that we have, or you might say old bottles, like the parable of Jesus, but to make it work in old models is that the changing of the world has created situations that are altogether different than they were before. And this not only affects the church's group efforts, it affects everybody's group efforts. You don't have to be a genius to look back to the 20th century, which is only 23 years ago. But you can look back to the 20th century, and at the end of the 20th century, if you lived in that era, you will know that there were changes that were coming, but we couldn't predict all of the impact that those changes would make. For example, until about 1980, there was not personal computers. They didn't even exist. And almost every guru in the computer and in the tech business and in the business world in whole said almost unequivocally that there'll never be a need of personal computers. There is no application for such a thing. This will not be a significant factor in business or in the world. So, bingo, you can see how little people knew because they were judging all of that by the present circumstances and the present business ecosystems that existed and the present organizational models that existed. Thinking in those terms, they could see no use, not knowing that there was a radical change that was coming. And so you can see this. Some of the very biggest companies in the world missed big parts of this. Some of them missed all of it and don't even exist anymore. And so you can't buy anything at Montgomery Ward's. Montgomery Ward's is out of business. It was one of the biggest retailers in the world for decades in the early 1900s, mid 1900s. Sears is virtually gone. It's got a few little stores. It's trying to still come along, but it's nothing like what it was. Kmart and on goes the list of these that were giants at one time. JCPenney struggles even now. It's still there, but it's struggling to make the shift and is not, by any stretch of the imagination, one of the major primary players in the world of retail. These things happen. Malls, while malls still exist, and there are malls that still have success, many malls have gone out of business. And I'm thinking of one of the most beautiful, no exaggeration, one of the most beautiful malls, the buildings, the architecture, everything that I have seen anywhere in America. It sits empty today. I don't even know if there's one business in it. Perhaps there's a few little old businesses where there's a space in the mall that has an outside door so people can come in without going in the mall. There's nothing in the mall. To my knowledge, the mall started and then quickly it lost its grip, its traction. Why? Because it was created at the end of the mall era. And by the time they got it created, the mall era had already declined further until malls are not today what they were. And many malls have just completely shut down. What does all that? What makes those kinds of changes? Well, there's many factors, more than I know, I'm sure. But there's some factors that become evident. And car manufacturers didn't see it. I mean, there's no more Oldsmobiles, there's no more Pontiacs, there's no more Mercurys, and numerous others that went by the wayside that were like iconic. They were like landmarks. I mean, they were like, this car will never go away. And now they no longer exist. That's just been a few years ago. You can still find some of those cars on the road, but you can't buy one unless it's a used one because they didn't take the trip. They didn't make the grade. Their quality was good enough, but the marketing, the thinking on it, something they didn't get. And there's radical changes that have come. So with that said, this is also true in the world of religion. When you look at the world of denominationalism has been declining since, like, I would say, the 1960s. It's been declining. It became huge in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It became a dominant force in the religious world, but now denominations have been on the decline, and they are still on the decline. And the new generations that have arisen they're not attracted to these kinds of things. So in the meantime, the need for group efforts continues. So how do we make group efforts work? This is a question. How do we get group togetherness to do great things for the world, for the gospel, for humans in general? How do we do that? This is the question. Well, first of all, we've got to recognize that old organizations, in many cases, have developed. It's impossible that they don't develop in most cases. They have developed a core, it's like residue of the work of the business, core things that they have come to think of as being essential parts of the organization. And really, they are just bureaucratic weight. And so bureaucracy comes into an organization, and bureaucracy becomes problematic. And there are people who are protecting positions. There's people who are protecting programs that they started or were instrumental in starting that are now shop-worn and heading towards being obsolete and are outdated. And yet these people cling to these things. Now, there's a whole study, an in-depth and profoundly revealing study on the subject of paradigms and how they started. The guy that really did the work on it was Thomas Kuhn, and he wrote a book back, I think it was in 1960, about the history of scientific discoveries. It's a very boring book. It's a very difficult book to read, but it is a very revealing book in that he studied all the scientific revolutions that had taken place and in history, all the major ones. And he found out that there were numerous commonalities in all of these scientific revolutions. They were all discovered and came to be embraced in the midst of enormous resistance, enormous struggle, because those who had already presented a conflicting view of the reality of things as science would show it, they were clinging to those. They were invested in those. So people become invested in old group efforts, infrastructures that actually become obstacles to the completion of the work. And they begin to judge the value of their work by, is the machinery shining? Is there money in the bank? All of those become the primary criteria. Now, all of that can be criteria, but the primary criteria, when that's not the real primary criteria, is the mission of this group togetherness, functioning to accomplish its purposes, or has the structure that's been put together originally to promote the mission overtaken the mission? And what happens in these situations is that the survival of the machinery becomes the primary element in the minds of the people who still embrace that old machinery, who are in love with it. That's all they know. It's the familiar. To be separated from that is to be terrified, and to resist, sometimes to the death. So one of the things that Thomas Kuhn found out, and we're not going to go into all that today, but one of the things that he found out is that, for example, an old paradigm never leaves the throne willingly, and it never leaves the throne. If it's the dominant paradigm, how things are done, it never leaves the throne without being thrown off. In most cases, violently. It has to be cast off. Another thing is it will not leave the throne because of rational argument. Like, can't you see that this isn't working? Can't you see that this is opportunity? Can't you see? And the answer is no. They don't see because they don't want to see. They are focused on antiquated and unfortunately obsolete ideas that are never going to produce. They may produce a trickle, but they'll never accomplish the big picture because we need a river of effective actions coming through that machinery and being organized in such a way as they can accomplish their purposes. So when we talk about this, we're talking about group efforts that avoid bureaucracy. How can we do that? Now, I'm not sure that there's any group that completely avoids bureaucracy, but we need to talk about that. We need to talk about that, especially if you're in the apostolic movement. We need to talk about that because we need answers and we need them quick, because even the youngest of our leaders begin to recognize, have already recognized that something could be done better. They don't know what to do either, but something needs to be done better. And so we're going to discuss this. We'll talk about it again tomorrow.